If you're getting into photography today, format names sound like a bizarre Starbucks menu. Full frame sounds huge, but medium format is somehow bigger. Micro Four Thirds is named after the aspect ratio of a 1990s tube TV. And APS-C, that's named after a failed film format from the 90s. Camera format naming these days is a mess. Okay, so who cares what these formats are called? I'm just being pedantic, maybe. But this kind of messy naming is confusing for photographers who don't have the context of where they come from. It's the kind of detail that when I first got interested in photography, it made it hard to understand what my options were. When I saw a photograph or a camera, to be able to contextualize how it would fit in. I'd find a camera on the shelf at the Valley Village or in my dad's closet and not know what kind of pictures it might take, what size of film it might use, or even that there were different sizes of film that cameras could use. Today's digital sensor names are historical artifacts that fit into the broader world of photography. To understand why your camera is named what it is and why full frame isn't actually that big, we have to look at 200 years of photography through three major eras: direct viewing, contact printing, and enlarging. The direct viewing era. Everything starts in 1839 with the Daguerreotype, the first commercial photographic process. Silver-plated copper sheets were exposed in camera and treated with mercury vapor to reveal a delicate image. This was the era of direct viewing. There was no negative. The plate inside the camera was the final photograph you held in your hand. To source plates, Louis Daguerre used standard 8 1/4 by 6 1/4 inch copper engraving plates. That size became known as whole plate. If you wanted a cheaper or more portable photograph, you cut that sheet down into a half plate, or a quarter plate, or a 6 plate, as small as you wanted to go. Because you were looking directly at the original plate, the camera size strictly dictated the final picture size. The contact printing era. By the 1850s, photography had shifted to glass plates, first wet and later dry plates in the late 1870s. Glass plates gave us negatives, meaning we could make multiple prints. But there was a catch. The print could only be the same size as the glass plate. And to make a print, you laid the light-sensitive paper directly under the glass plate and you exposed it to light. This was the era of contact printing. If you wanted an 8 by 10 inch photo on your wall, you needed an 8 by 10 glass plate inside your 8 by 10 camera. You want a massive group portrait? You needed a mammoth banquet camera. The old plate sizes carried on, but new sizes were introduced like 8 by 10 and 4 by 5 to match paper sizes for prints and to allow photographers to make larger images in a variety of aspect ratios. When George Eastman replaced heavy fragile glass with flexible sheet film, and then with roll film, powering the 1900 Kodak Brownie, photography became accessible to everyone. But snapshot photos were still contact printed. Roll film formats were explicitly sized based on how big you wanted your finished paper snapshot to be. So 122 format film was the size of an actual postcard. And the 120 film loaded into the popular Kodak Brownie camera supported handy snapshot sizes like 6 by 9 or 6 by 6. The enlarging and miniature film era. So where does 35mm film fit into this? In 1913, Oscar Barnack took a small 35mm movie film and built a compact test camera around it, creating the legendary Leica. Kodak started loading the film into handy light-proof cartridges, and they called the format 135. At less than half the frame size of the smallest daguerreotype plate, 35mm was considered a miniature format. It was way too small to make a good contact print. To get a usable picture, you had to project light through the tiny negative and blow it up onto paper. This kicked off the era of enlarging. Once commercial labs adopted enlargers in the 1950s, 35mm exploded. The shift forced photographers, though, to adopt names now based on scale. Tiny 35mm film was miniature format. The giant glass plates and sheet films, they became large format. And the roll film trapped in the middle, it became medium format. Once enlarging your prints was the standard, Kodak made a couple more attempts to shrink the amount of film that they had to sell you and package it into even easier loading cartridges. That parade of miniature formats included 126 Instamatic, 110 film, disc film, and the Advanced Photo System, or APS. None were as successful as 135. Since the middle of the 20th century, 35mm has reigned supreme as the most popular film format in history. The digital era, which brings us to the digital revolution. Silicon sensors are expensive to manufacture per square millimeter. At the turn of the 21st century, making a digital sensor the full size of a 35mm film frame was cost prohibitive for a consumer camera. So camera makers opted for smaller sensors, with most of them matching the size of the recent failed 90s film format, APS-C. With an overall surface area that was only 43% the size of 135, the savings in silicon were substantial. But in the horizontal and vertical dimensions, it meant a frame size that was about 2/3 that of 135. Close enough that most camera makers simply kept using their existing camera mounts and lenses. But because these smaller sensors cropped the image circle of traditional 135 lenses, photographers called them crop sensor. Years later, when manufacturing improved and brands finally released digital sensors that matched the full 24 by 36 millimeter frame of 35mm film, what did they market it as? Full frame. Think about the irony. 35mm was invented as a miniature movie format, but after a decade of digital crop sensors, it got rebranded as the grand full frame. Meanwhile, Micro Four Thirds created a modern mirrorless system around a sensor size optimized for lightweight cameras and lenses. By building a whole new format and lens mount, Micro Four Thirds avoided the confusion and stigma around cropping legacy lenses and played to the strengths of digital imaging. As for the name, they put the aspect ratio right there. Marketers played up 4/3 as a clean sheet digital standard, and the 4/3 ratio as a better fit for printing than the 3:2 ratio of 135 or APS-C. As for the micro part, it doesn't have anything to do with the size of the sensor. This format was first introduced as 4/3, and the cameras were all SLRs with a longer flange focal distance required for the mirror box. But when the 4/3 partners evolved their standard for mirrorless cameras and they shrunk the flange focal distance, they tacked micro onto 4/3, yielding a name that described both the aspect ratio and the flange focal distance, unlike any other format in history. Digital medium format, on the other hand, fully leans into their connection with the medium format film history. Ironically, though, because they're using 44 by 33mm sensors, which is actually smaller than 645 roll film. It's more like 345 format. But it gets marketed as the ultimate big boy sensor. I understand. We hunger for digital sensors to be as big as possible. We want to recreate the field of view and rendering from classic cameras like the Rolleiflex or the Pentax 67. But the constraint of silicon pricing keeps our dreams in check. So digital medium format is, in context, just barely hanging on to the medium format name, while we all keep hoping for a true full-frame 6x6 or 6x7 sensor to one day arrive at a price that won't bankrupt a small nation. In conclusion, well, the point is, Our digital formats live in the broader context of photography. When you look at the last 200 years, every format was a compromise between camera portability and print size. Different formats emerged to meet the specific needs of each era. Direct viewing required large plates. Contact printing required equally large negatives. But enlarging the film optically made miniature 35mm possible. And digital made smaller crop sensors the default starting point. But the weight of recent history pushed the 135 format to dominate the conversation once again. The photography formats that emerged over the past 200 years are not just trapped in time either. Older formats live on. Photographers today are working in many of these formats. They're using roll film, sheet film, and even glass plates. They're using materials and cameras that are still being made today. Many historical frame sizes and dimensions echo through the centuries. They remain as standards for making photographs and prints to this day. We buy picture frames and photo albums for prints in classic sizes like 8x10. The fun little Fuji Instax Mini creates nearly the same size of image as 1/16 plate Daguerreotypes. And they get used for the same purposes, keeping tiny, intimate portraits of the people we love. And micro four thirds cameras, they use the same aspect ratio as whole plate cameras from 200 years earlier, proving the staying power of classic photographic formats. Our current digital formats live within this context. There's a whole world of photography beyond the handful of sizes we know today. So the next time someone tells you full frame is the gold standard, remember, it's just 100-year-old miniature movie film rebranded for a digital world.